So, excuse me. We've been away from this for a couple of Sundays, but last Sunday we picked up again our journey through the Gospel of Matthew. And Neil, my lines are looking a little blurry. It's because I need these. So just give me a moment. So Neil spoke last Sunday, sharing some good stuff with us out of Matthew chapter 9. Thank you, Neil. He's not here, but thank you anyway. But so today we're on to Matthew chapter 10. And at the beginning of chapter 10, Jesus commissions his 12 disciples. He sends them out with power. And yeah, if you have your Bible with you, just turn to that, Matthew chapter 10. And here, as I say, at the outset of chapter 10, Jesus sends out his disciples, his apostles, with power. And the last 4 verses of chapter 9 really serve as an introduction to chapter 10. What takes place in chapter 10 is really first mentioned and talked about. It's set up at the end of chapter 9. So I want to spend a bit of time actually in the end of chapter 9, reflecting on the end of that chapter, and then we're going to move and think a little bit about the beginning of chapter 10. So I want us to read the last 4 verses of Matthew chapter 9, and then we're going to read the first 8 verses of Matthew chapter 10. So let's read Matthew 9, and we're going 35 to 38. It says this: Then Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the gospel of the kingdom and healing every sickness and every disease among the people. But when he saw the multitudes, he was moved with compassion for them, because they were weary and they were scattered like sheep, having no shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, The harvest truly is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore pray the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. And then on to chapter 10, verses 1 to 8. And when he had called his 12 disciples to him, he gave them power over unclean spirits to cast them out and to heal all kinds of sickness and all kinds of disease. Now the names of the 12 apostles are these: first Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew his brother, James the son of Zebedee, and John his brother, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the tax collector, James the son of Alphaeus and Lebbaeus, whose surname was Thaddeus, Simon the Canaanite, and Judas Iscariot, who also betrayed him. These 12 Jesus sent out and commanded them, saying, Do not go into the way of the Gentiles, and do not enter a city of the Samaritans, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And as you go, preach, saying, The kingdom of heaven is at hand. Heal the sick, cleanse the lepers, raise the dead, cast out demons. Freely you have received, freely give. So at the end of chapter 9, verse 35, we're told that Jesus went about all the cities and villages teaching and preaching, and he healed every sickness and every disease of those who flocked to him, of those who followed him. Jesus was busy ministering in verse 35. He was busy giving out. He was busy meeting the needs of the people. And then in verse 36, it's like Jesus takes kind of a time out. He takes a pause. He pauses from giving to the crowd, and he kind of takes stock of his situation, takes stock of what's going on around him and those around him. He shifts from giving to the crowd simply to taking in the crowd. And verse 36 opens with this: But when he saw the multitudes, Jesus saw the multitudes. I was struck by that phrase. He saw the multitudes. I thought to myself, he saw them how? He saw them as what? As just one mass of people? As one big throng, all the same, just a homogeneous bunch? Grasping none of the little, or none or little of their individual journeys, of their challenges, of their personal joys, sorrows, pain. Was that all just lost to him because they were a crowd, because they were a multitude? And no, that's not the case at all. Verse 36 says that despite the fact there were multitudes, lots of people, he saw, he appreciated, he discerned where they were at. What mattered most to them? What was most important to them? The fact they were weary. They were tired, harassed, it says in some versions. They were scattered. They were lost. it says they were like sheep having no shepherd. And I just want to say to you this morning, do you know that Jesus sees the multitude? He sees the multitudes. He sees you despite the fact you're part of a multitude. He sees you and what you're going through, the things that are unique about you and your circumstances and your journey, the particular nuances of your situation, your journey, despite the fact you're part of a multitude. You're part of 40 or 50 people here this morning. You're part of the multitude of Christians all around the world. You're part of the multitude of all the people in the world. And though you're part of a crowd, you're part of a multitude, he sees you. He sees the multitude. He sees you in it. Despite the fact you're part of the crowd, to Jesus, you are not lost in the crowd. So Jesus saw this multitude, this crowd, described as being like sheep without a shepherd. And I reflected for quite a while on that, on sheep without a shepherd. What are sheep without a shepherd? What are they like? How do they behave? Well, we know sheep need a shepherd. Sheep need a shepherd to care for them, to guard them, to protect them, to guide them. And without that, working from what verse 36 says, they become weary. They become tired. They don't rest when they should. They don't rest as much as they should. They don't rest where they should. They overexert themselves. They fail to pace themselves. I learned that sheep without a shepherd become highly anxious, stressed, vulnerable. They worry, they fret. That just adds to their weariness, to their tiredness. And I thought to myself, we're just the same. We're just the same. We do the same things if we don't have a shepherd. Without Jesus as our shepherd, we become weary. We become tired. We don't rest when we should. We don't rest as much as we should. When left to our own devices, we worry, we fret, we fear. That's why Jesus said 2 chapters on in Matthew 11, come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I'll give you rest. And I'll give you rest. We need Jesus, our shepherd, guiding us, steering us, controlling especially our thoughts, our minds, so we don't labor. We don't become heavy laden with worry, with fret, with fear. So without a shepherd, sheep become weary, they become tired. And the same goes for us. Without a shepherd, without Jesus as our shepherd, we too can become weary, tired through worry, anxiety, fretting. Some versions, as I say, it's in verse 36, rather than the multitudes being weary, they say the multitudes were harassed. What's harassed mean? Sheep without a shepherd are harassed. They're troubled. They're agitated. They're perturbed. They're restless. They're not at peace. Why? Why is that? One reason is because sheep are prey animals. They have predators. Other animals prey on sheep. For instance, wild animals. You know, another factor in sheep being preyed on is shepherds who pose as shepherds. Shepherds who pose as shepherds. Jesus talked about this, didn't he, in the Gospel of John? Shepherds who, when the predator comes, who when the wolf comes, as Jesus put it, when danger comes, they don't protect the sheep. They don't care for the sheep. They take off and abandon the sheep. And it becomes apparent, as Jesus said, they're hirelings. Only in it for themselves, only in it for the money. They don't really care about the sheep, their safety, their well-being. They prove not to be genuine shepherds. They prove to be counterfeit shepherds. And you know, in a similar way, when we don't have Jesus as our shepherd, we are harassed. We are harassed by wild animals, the things, the counterfeit life sources that we plug into. Whatever it is we seek to draw our life from other than Jesus, and those life sources prove to be hirelings. They prove to be hirelings, things that don't really help us, that don't really benefit us. In fact, quite the opposite. They take life away from us. They allure us, sure. They have a front end, a thin veneer, draw attraction to us. They initially feel good. They briefly deliver, but then they drop us. And our end state is worse than where we started from. And we're left harassed, we're left troubled, we're left empty by those counterfeit life sources, whatever it may be. So sheep without a shepherd are tired. They're weary. Without Jesus as our shepherd, so are we. Jesus without a shepherd are harassed. They are agitated. They're unsettled. They're restless. Without Jesus as our shepherd, when we plug into other life sources, we are too left harassed, troubled, unsettled, empty. Lastly, it says in verse 36, the multitude was scattered. They were scattered like sheep without a shepherd. Sheep without a shepherd are scattered. They are lost. They are lost. Listen to some of what I found out about sheep when they have no shepherd. And it seemed to me there's a lot we can learn from this. Sheep without a shepherd are lost. They're defenseless. They're prone to wandering aimlessly or in dangerous self-destructive circles. Due to their nature as followers with poor navigation abilities, a shepherdless flock often wanders into danger or acts in ways that lead to their own harm. They wander aimlessly and in circles, often following one another in aimless, winding paths. In panic, they may gather together and run in tight circles. They lack an internal GPS to find food or water on their own. And sheep are hardwired to follow. And if a leader sheep, listen to this, if a leader sheep wanders off a cliff, the rest of the flock will likely follow it. A lost sheep cannot find its way back home on its own. It'll stay lost until the shepherd finds it. And as I reflected on that, I thought, doesn't that sound familiar? Doesn't that sound reminiscent of us without Jesus as our shepherd? Without him as our shepherd, like shepherdless sheep, we wander around aimlessly in circles going nowhere of true significance. Without Jesus as our shepherd, like shepherdless sheep, we wander in dangerous, self-destructive circles. Whether the circle of worry, of fear, of doubt, of unforgiveness, of lust, of jealousy, of bitterness, whatever that destructive circle might be, that we get stuck in and go round and around it. Circles that hurt us, circles that harm us. When we don't have Jesus as our shepherd, like shepherdless sheep, we follow one another in aimless, winding paths. We follow someone or something, and there's so much stuff out there to follow these days. Into who knows what, off a cliff maybe. And just like sheep, we lack an internal GPS to find food or water, to find what is best for us. To find what is best for us. Left to ourselves, we can't find, we don't know what we really need. And left to ourselves, we certainly don't know our way back home. Our way back home, our way back home to God, who has all that we truly need. Without Jesus as our shepherd, we're like shepherdless sheep. We're weary, we're harassed, we're scattered, we're lost. And Jesus sees all this. He sees the crowd, the individuals in it, what they're experiencing, what they're going through, tired, agitated, lost. And what's his response? What's his response? Is it judgment? Is it harshness? Does he shake and wag his finger at them and say, you guys should know better? Come on, get your act together. Get your stuff together. Figure it out. No, it says he was moved with compassion. He was moved with compassion. That was Jesus' response, his sentiment towards this needy crowd. And it's his response towards us. Regarding our own personal weariness, our own feelings of being harassed and troubled by whatever it is, our own feelings of emptiness, our own feeling of being scattered, of being lost, of being unsure of our way forward in life right now. Jesus has compassion. He has compassion, but it doesn't stop there. Jesus doesn't just have compassion on us. He doesn't just empathize with us. He doesn't just feel bad on our behalf, join us in identifying with our pain. He's moved, it says, with compassion. He's moved with compassion, moved to action. Moved to action because he sees our harried state. And because he knows why we're harried and stressed, why we're stressed, why we're not at peace, because we have no shepherd, we have no genuine shepherd who truly cares for us as he does. And either we have no shepherd at all, or we have a shepherd, we have Jesus as our shepherd, but we're not letting him shepherd us. We're not letting him shepherd us. We've become disconnected from him, but we've taken, because we've taken a matter into our own hands, insisting on doing our own shepherding, insisting on shepherding ourselves, and in the process, sidelighting our genuine shepherd, who we really need. And Jesus, more than anyone, knows who our genuine, who our good shepherd is. And he says to us that, and who the shepherd is that we need. And he says to us that, he tells us that in John 10:11, I am the good shepherd. I am the good shepherd. In other words, I'm the genuine shepherd. I'm the real deal when it comes to the shepherd, the guidance, the help you need in your life. I'm the shepherd who will truly alleviate, who will truly lift, who will truly end your weariness, your harassed, your empty state, your scattered, your lost condition. Jesus then in verse 37 of Matthew 9, Jesus says to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful. The harvest is plentiful. What is the harvest? What is the harvest? Well, in terms of the preceding verse that we've been reflecting on, verse 36, the harvest is when any disconnected, lost, wandering sheep finds the shepherd. Finds the shepherd. Actually, Jesus didn't say to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful. He said the harvest truly is plentiful. Truly is plentiful. In other words, he was saying it isn't a matter of just a few lost sheep out there who are ambivalent, to whom it's no big deal that they're lost. No, there are a lot of weary, harassed, lost sheep out there who are wanting a shepherd, who are desperate for a shepherd, who are ready to come home and to be led home, who are ready to connect with me. But the laborers are few. The signposts to the shepherd are few. The messengers pointing to the shepherd, to me, Jesus was saying, are few. And then verse 38 is the last verse of chapter 9. Jesus says to his disciples, so pray. So pray that God will send out laborers, signposts, guides to the shepherd, into the multitude, into the sea of people out there who need the shepherd and are ready to follow him. And so that ends chapter 9. And then Jesus at the beginning of chapter 10 takes action. He takes action. He takes action as part of the answer to the very prayer he's just instructed his disciples to pray in the last verse of chapter 9. He said to them in chapter 9, pray. The Lord of the harvest will send out laborers into his harvest. And at the beginning of chapter 10, Jesus himself sends out laborers into his harvest field, into his Father's harvest field. Chapter 10 verse 5 says, these 12 Jesus sent out. Sent out. The 12 disciples, the 12 apostles, Jesus sent out into the weary, into the scattered multitudes of chapter 9, spoken of as being like lost, wandering sheep. And the lost sheep theme is carried over into chapter 10. Verse 6, he tells the apostles, go to who? Go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So he saw the multitudes like scattered lost sheep in chapter 9, end of chapter 9. He says, now go to those lost sheep in chapter 10, verse 6. Go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So this particular mission was focused, specifically targeting, as Jesus put it, the lost sheep of the house of Israel, the Jews. This mission preparing the disciples for the future, broader, wider mission Jesus would send them on. A commentary I read put it like this: this was the first mission which the apostles had, much different from that given them after Jesus' resurrection. They were now sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, of Israel. Then they were sent to all the nations, to all the nations. So let's just read again the beginning of chapter 10, just verses 1 to 4. And I want to reflect a little on these verses, beginning of chapter 10, 1 to 4. So when he, Jesus, had called his 12 disciples to him, he gave them power over unclean spirits to cast them out and to heal all kinds of sickness and all kinds of disease. Now the names of the 12 apostles are these: first Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew his brother, James the son of Zebedee, and John his brother. Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the tax collector, James the son of Alphaeus, Lebbaeus, whose surname was Thaddeus, Simon the Canaanite, and Judas Iscariot, who also betrayed him. In exploring this passage, I leaned quite heavily on some material I found, and I came across these comments from others on the transition from chapter 9 of Matthew to chapter 10. They said this: Matthew 10 verse 1 and the following verses speak of empowering for mission, or empowerment for mission. The verses mark a shift where the disciples move from merely observing Jesus' ministry to performing it themselves. The passage highlights the partnership between Jesus and his followers, emphasizing that he equips them, he equips us for the work he calls us to do. In Matthew 10:1, Jesus authorized his 12 disciples to extend his ministry by casting out unclean spirits and healing diseases, making their transition from learners, from disciples to sent representatives, apostles. And this empowerment demonstrates that Jesus grants power and authority to fulfill the calling he gives. And if that is true for Jesus' 12 disciples, apostles, if that is true for the disciples back then, it's true for us today. It's true for us today. What Jesus calls us to do, whatever it is, he empowers us to do. And like them, he has delegated us to preach the kingdom and to demonstrate the power of the kingdom through our own transformed lives, but by us also being agents of transformation, bringing healing and restoration and transformation to other people's lives. And Jesus equips us and Jesus empowers us for this, just as he empowered his 12 disciples in these verses. Some more observations coming from others in these verses. Moving from Matthew chapter 9 to chapter 10, there's a delegation of authority. Jesus transferred his own miracle working authority to the 12. This signified that the disciples' powers derived solely from him, not their own strength. And again, what was true for them is true for us today. The power we have in our lives to preach, to share the gospel, to bring to effect change in our lives, the lives of others, is power given to us by Jesus, derived solely from him. This is not about our power, our own strength that brings these things about. It's all about Jesus. It's all about Jesus. And one commentary put it like this: the disciples of Jesus did, though not as Christ did them, things which none but God could do by a derivation of power from him, from Christ. Christ did the same things, but by a power inherent in him. So we experience and we seek to minister the miraculous. By power we derive, we draw from Christ. Where Christ did those things by power he had in himself. In himself. We experience and we seek to minister the miraculous by power we derive, we draw from Christ. But Christ did those things by power he had in himself. Jesus gave power to his disciples to do miracles, to heal all kinds of sicknesses, it says, and all kinds of disease. What was the purpose of the miracles? What was the purpose of the miracles? Again, an observation comment I found helpful in answering that question said this: the purpose of miracles, the authority to heal every disease and sickness, did two things. First of all, it validated the disciples' message. It acted as a witness to the authenticity, the truth of their message. It added weight to their message. That's one thing the miracles did. But it also demonstrated the message. It demonstrated the intangible, concrete terms that the gospel is about healing, that the gospel is about restoration. It heals, it restores on every level, a person's body, a person's soul, and a person's spirits. Some further thoughts I gleaned from others in my preparation. In verse 2 of chapter 10, the 12 disciples are referred to as apostles. The word apostles, many of you know, literally means one who is sent. Their role was they were sent by Jesus to act in his place. And we are called to a similar role today. We are sent by Jesus to act in his place, to reflect him, to represent him, and to demonstrate him. That is what we've been called to do. as I reflected on the verses we've read, both in chapter 9 and chapter 10, I was reminded of a question that is deemed a critical question in the business world for optimizing performance in business. And it was coined by one of the modern day management kind of gurus. And the question is simply this, and I'm sure you've heard it. The question is simply this: what is our business? A business needs to ask that of themselves. What is our business? And it relates to a business's mission. A business being clear on why it exists, what it exists to do. And it also relates to its customers, who they are, being clear about the customers they are targeting. And it got me thinking, what is God's business? What is God's business? What is his mission? And continuing that business analogy, who are God's customers? Who are those he's primarily targeting? And I think the verses we've read and reflected on give us the answer to those questions, both in verse 36 of Matthew 9 that we've reflected on. They tell us that Jesus was moved with compassion. Why? Because the multitude were like sheep with no shepherd. The people were lost sheep. We find that out in chapter 9. And then, as I've said, in verse 6 of chapter 10, we've seen that the disciples, apostles, were sent to the lost sheep of Israel. And it came to me, that's God's business. That's God's business. Lost sheep is God's business. That's the customer he targets, lost sheep. His mission to rescue, to retrieve lost sheep and to bring them home. And to bring them home. That's God's heartbeat. That's the harvest. So as I said earlier, the last section, the last few verses of Matthew 9, they serve to introduce what happens at the start of Matthew 10. And so just summarizing what happens going from chapter 9 to chapter 10. In chapter 10, first of all, Jesus is moved with compassion for the multitudes, for the people who are lost sheep. And he points out to the disciples just how many lost sheep there are. The harvest is plentiful. How many sheep there are that need rescuing. And so he tells them to pray for more laborers to be sent out, to become involved in his lost sheep rescuing mission. And then chapter 10, Jesus sends his 12 disciples out to the lost sheep of Israel to join his lost sheep mission, to be involved in rescuing them. Or another way, I just walked my way through in summary of this transition from chapter 9 to chapter 10, just summing it up. In verse 36 of chapter 9, Jesus sees and is moved with compassion for the mission, for rescuing, retrieving lost sheep. In verse 37, he draws attention to the scale of the mission. Again, the harvest is plentiful. There are lots of lost sheep out there to be rescued. And in verse 38, Jesus mobilizes prayer for the mission. And then in chapter 10, verse 6, Jesus sends into the mission. He sends laborers into the mission to the lost sheep. And the result is a transition from Jesus doing something to from Jesus being on mission to his disciples being on mission, to his disciples doing something. In chapter 9:35, we read that Jesus went about preaching the gospel, the kingdom, and healing every sickness and every disease. And then in chapter 10, the disciples are given power to heal all kinds of sickness and all kinds of disease. Jesus then sending them out, telling them to preach as they go, preach that the kingdom of heaven is at hand, and to heal the sick. And so what Jesus did at the end of chapter 9, the disciples are doing at the beginning of chapter 10. Jesus invited them to, he involved them in his mission to lost sheep, to rescue lost sheep. And Jesus' original 12 disciples are not the only disciples he seeks to involve in his mission of rescuing lost sheep. In Matthew 9, Jesus preached and exercised power over sickness and disease to rescue the lost. In chapter 10, Jesus' original 12 were sent out with power to preach and heal the sick, to rescue the lost. And at the end of the Gospels, of Matthew and Mark, we find the Great Commission, along with similar commissions at the end of Luke and John, through which we are sent. We are commissioned to preach the gospel, to exercise power, to lay hands on the sick who will recover. We are sent out to rescue the lost. And so preaching and exercising God's power, preaching the gospel, exercising his power to rescue the lost, goes from Jesus in Matthew 9 to his 12 disciples in Matthew 10 to us through the Great Commission and similar commissions in the gospel. Jesus invites us to join him in his harvest, in his mission of rescuing the lost, of bringing lost sheep home. Just in closing, I want to just reflect with you a little bit on verses 2 to 4 of chapter 10, where the 12 apostles are listed, where the 12 apostles are named. And some of these apostles we know something about from other parts of Scripture. And their names remind us of some of the specific, the unique things we're told about them, and how different they all were to one another. Yet they were all called. They were all empowered. They were all equipped by Jesus and sent out to represent and serve him, and did so powerfully. They were all used by God to carry out his work. So let's reflect on some of these characters, some of these names in the list. First of all, you got Peter, who, as one source put it, is widely characterized in the gospel as impetuous, as brash, as quick to speak or act, often without thinking through the implications. He's frequently portrayed as the first of the disciples to speak up, to act or volunteer, which often resulted in him putting his foot in his mouth. Peter is known too, of course, as one who failed, who denied Jesus 3 times. But despite all those things I've told you about Peter, he was one of the apostles, sent out by Jesus to do his work, empowered to find and bring in the lost. And of course, it was Jesus who gave him the name Peter, meaning rock. Speaking of the change Jesus brought to his life, from one who was unsteady and impetuous and failing to one who became steady and firm and dependable, who played a critical role in the birth of the church and was foundational, was a rock himself in its beginnings and in its establishment. And I thought to myself, maybe some of us relate to Peter in some way. Maybe we're a bit impetuous, quick to speak. Maybe our mouth sometimes gets us in trouble. Maybe we failed like Peter. But I want to say, don't be discouraged. God took and worked with Peter. He changed and transformed him. He made his failures work for him. God made them stepping stones to success. That's what he did with Peter's failures. They became stepping stones to success. And God used Peter mightily. And what God did in Peter, what God did for Peter, what God did through Peter, he can do and he wants to do in you, for you, through you, transforming you into a Peter, into a rock, a strong, dependable, consistent follower of his. Let's go on to another person in this list, Matthew. Matthew, the tax collector. He very likely had a pretty shady past. Tax collectors in Jesus' day worked for the Roman occupying forces. They collected money from their fellow countrymen on behalf of the Romans. So to boot, as well as being, they had a bad reputation for being dishonest, they were very unpopular. They were despised. They were looked down on. Even more so, as I say, because they also had a reputation of being very dishonest, of making dishonest money through the whole processes of collecting taxes. For instance, they just overtax people and then give the Romans what they should have taxed the person and keep the extra. And they were just known as thieves and swindlers. And you know, maybe some of us, like Matthew, have had pasts we're not proud of. We've done things we shouldn't have, things we wish we hadn't. We have some painful and real regrets. And I want to say, let Matthew be an encouragement to us. Let him be an encouragement to us. He turned from thieving tax collector to be an apostle of Jesus, when sent out by him and used powerfully by God. And what Jesus did for Matthew, he can do for me, he can do for you. The transformation he brought about in him, he can bring about in you. And then on to verse 4, there's a gentleman there, a character identified as Simon the Canaanite. Simon the Canaanite, likely he came from a place called Canaan. Now in another place, in another of these lists, there are several of them throughout the Gospels. In the one in Luke, this Simon is called Simon the Zealot. Simon the Zealot. And I found this out about Simon. Simon the Zealot was part of a group of religious fanatics who often used violence to fight against the Roman rule occupation that existed in Israel in Jesus' day. So I was thinking to myself, if Simon had come through COVID with us, he would have been anti-vax, anti-mask, anti-everything, and anything the establishment told us to do. He was mega anti-establishment. And you know, so Simon was polar opposite to Matthew, right? Matthew worked for. He was in cahoots with the occupying Roman government, while Simon fought against it. Fought against it. And in a similar list to this of the apostles' names in the Gospel of Luke, Matthew and Simon's names are together in a group of names. And the source I drew from to learn about Simon said this: the pairing of Simon's name with Matthew, a tax collector for Rome, is a deliberate demonstration of the unity that Christ can bring. Of the unity that Christ can bring. Two men with very different outlooks, with very different positions, yet both transformed by Christ and united in Christ. More evidence of the powerful changes that God can bring to our lives. And lastly, and we'll end with this, Judas Iscariot is listed. Judas Iscariot, who betrayed Jesus. Judas was used by God at this time. He was sent out with power to preach the gospel and to heal the sick. I mean, the failure of Judas so overshadows him, I think we forget that he did anything good. But here he was being sent out in the power of the Holy Spirit to preach the gospel, to heal the sick, and he did it. But Judas didn't continue that way, did he? Judas didn't continue that way. His love for Jesus and his mission, his love for the lost, was eclipsed. It was overshadowed by his love for something else. His love of money. His love of money. And Judas' name in this list, along with the note of where Judas ended up, where he ended up betraying Jesus, is a sobering reminder to us that wherever we are in God today, however powerfully God has used us, is using us today, it does not guarantee tomorrow. Don't ride on the past, don't ride on the present. It doesn't guarantee tomorrow. We can only be sure of continuing on a healthy trajectory for Christ, with Christ, if every day we keep our hearts soft, we keep our hearts humble, we keep our hearts surrendered to Him, to Christ, not allowing the love of anything else to taint or crowd out our love for Him. So let's allow Judas to remind us all that we can't rest on the past or even on the present. Our only way of securing a healthy, a fruitful future, continue to be on mission with Jesus to rescue the lost, is to do what Jesus called us to do, to take up our cross daily. Jesus said daily, to die, to be crucified with Christ, as Paul talked about, daily. Daily rejecting all that would take us from Christ, that would cool our love for Him, and every day leaning into Him, embracing Him, our relationship with Him, loving Him, and nurturing our walk with Him. So just a closing comment, going from Matthew 9 into Matthew 10, we see a significant transition. From Jesus on mission to His disciples being sent on mission. And it's a reminder that like them, we have been sent on mission by the Great Commission and the other commissions in the Gospels. We may be weak. We may be like some of those characters in that list. We may have failed. We may have things in our past we wish weren't there. But we see these same things in the 12 apostles. Were no different. They were no different, and God changed these men. And may be an encouragement to us, that whatever has or does exist in our lives, if we surrender wholly to God, God will use us, God will work through us, as He did through the 12 disciples, transformed to 12 apostles, powerful men of God. Amen. Amen. Mary Rose, I wonder if you'd come and lead us in a song in closing. I want to say